Good afternoon, everyone, and we'll start this session, which is focused on India's green transformation, the world's green transformation, and how we actually pay for it. Because, as we all know, unless we line up the appropriate green financing for some of the important measures, some of the important initiatives that are required for a green transformation, that transformation will not happen. And so to discuss that, to discuss what are the challenges and opportunities that India and the world face as we undertake this green transformation, we're very pleased this afternoon to have a stellar panel, a wonderful panel. I can't think of other distinguished panelist speakers that would be more capable of shedding light on this set of topics and the people we have with us this afternoon. And the way we will get started is that I will ask each of the distinguished panelists to start off with some initial remarks, maybe 3 or 4 minutes on green transformation, how to pay for it, what their experiences have been, what they think best practices are. And then I'll follow up after those initial remarks with some questions, some observations. And to the extent possible, given that we have about 45 minutes for this session, we would be very happy to take questions from all of you as well, addressed to the panelists. And just before we conclude, we have an important report that I and my colleagues at the ORF have been working on, which is on India's green transformation, some observations and suggestions based on what we have seen other countries undertake. And we will just very quickly release that report and ask you all, if interested, to take a look at it. So with that as the short introduction, I'd like to now turn to the Honorable Prime Minister of Korea, former Prime Minister, to give us his initial remarks on green transformation and how to pay for it. The Honorable Prime Minister.
Thank you very much. Climate change, of course, is the issue on which the future of humanity so critically depends. And I am sorry that COP25 failed in meeting the demand of the people. The main reason is not really finance, but it was on the mitigation, because they could not agree on the types of carbon trading. And because the price of carbon is decided by demand and supply, and supply side wanted to have that part their own credit, and demand side also wants. So it is particularly Australia, Brazil, Saudi Arabia, other countries who wanted to make use of loophole. Therefore, it failed. But next year, or this year, in December, Ms. O'Neill will be the chief negotiator in Glasgow, and it's her responsibility that it should be done. Now, on climate change, I think the most important fact is that climate change. Why is climate change the problem? Because this was the result of the first industrial revolution, which I said invented the steam engine, and second industrial revolution, which invented the combustion engine. Both, first one wanted the coal, second one oil and gas, which produce a lot of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So what we really need is to change the paradigm shift in growth models. Up until now, most of us were making use of so-called quantitative growth model. Capital and labor are a very important part of it. But then there are many other factors that can affect the growth. So what I'm trying to say is that we have to change the paradigm. We have to change the paradigm. We have to shift the paradigm from the so-called quantitative growth to qualitative growth. By doing so, we will be able to solve a fundamental problem of this climate change. When I was the Prime Minister of Korea, I initiated green growth in Korea, and we have a 5-year plan on green growth. And also when I went to Paris as a chair of the OECD Ministerial Council meeting in June 2009, I was able to garner the unanimous support of the delegate ministers to pass a resolution on green growth. That was June 2009. And based on that resolution, OECD carried out 2-year in-depth study on green growth and produced a monumental document entitled Towards Green Growth in 2011 to mark the 50th anniversary of OECD. Based on that document, most of the OECD countries shifted or at least tried to change their growth model. In that document, there are 4 countries which was taken as an example. This report refers to UK, Germany, and California, all developed countries. So for the developing countries, some of them may be relevant, but some of them are not. But in that report, OECD recommended to look at the case of Korea, Ireland, Rwanda in Africa, and China. Particularly China is a very interesting case because when they started the 12th six-year plan, 2011, they introduced green development element into their development program. And then in the 13th development plan that started in 2016, they continue to include that part. So they have been now experimenting with the green development program for the last 10 years. And a substantial part of that program has been put into practice. So I think in case of India, maybe instead of looking to the west, maybe it's better to look to the east, Korea and China, to see what kind of lesson India can learn from this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Honorable Prime Minister. Now, I'll just scramble the order a little bit because you alluded to COP25, and we are very fortunate this afternoon and during the Raisina Dialogue to have Ms. O'Neill, who is, of course, the chief negotiator on COP26. So with that as a great segue, Ms. O'Neill, would you give us your perspectives on, given the challenges that we saw during COP25 and the inability to make substantial progress on very important targets, initiatives that were required, how do you anticipate, how do you see COP26 playing out?
Thank you very much. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. I just want to very slightly disagree with my Prime Ministerial friend. COP25 was disappointing, but a lot of progress was made. It is incredible to see 197 countries come together annually to focus on an issue that even 5 years ago, you would have a reliable report in the media that this was all a conspiracy. We don't hear that now. What we hear is an urgent and amplifying call to action coming from governments, from our citizens, from cities, states, companies. And also we did make progress on really important parts of the negotiations. 121 countries have now committed to update their nationally determined contributions, their own ambitions, and others have contributed to provide a plan, a long-term plan for that. And there is a saying based on the experience we've now had holding 25 of these, that you quite often get a bad COP before you get a good COP. So I experienced people in the room will remember that we had some fairly difficult times at Copenhagen. We've had difficult before we actually had the successes in Paris. But it's not enough, like a financial investor, just to look for historical patterns. We have to work to improve the outcome. So a couple of words on what we're looking, early stage, looking to this COP to deliver. And I should say that as the COP president, this is my first international visit along with a big delegation from the UK, because we see working with our friends and partners in India as absolutely vital, not just delivering a good COP, but delivering a low carbon development pathway with CO2 coming down. So we will be ambitious around the negotiations. We will redouble our efforts to make those a positive and sensible series of conversations. We will be looking for improved ambition in nationally determined contributions. There is an argument that says that's just a plan, what we need is action, and there are amazing actions to celebrate. But it's very helpful, and it's very helpful from an investor's point of view to understand where a country wants to go to, where a country is going, and is there a coherence between what governments say and what they're actually committing to do. We will also be providing a platform for the action that is happening right across the world. In India, you should be absolutely proud of the ambition and the action that your Prime Minister Modi is leading. It's incredible to see what India has delivered in terms of renewable energy, in terms of energy efficiency, in terms of adaptation and resilience investment. And we want to celebrate that, but also celebrate the incredible work that states like California, cities around the world, companies, of which again you have many world-leading companies and financial institutions are bringing, because all of that adds up to a CO2 reduction plan. We'll be focusing on natural solutions for climate recovery. There's a huge amount of discourse at the moment about biodiversity and nature-based climate recovery, and it's time to amplify that and to actually create some transparency mechanisms around it. And we will be focusing on adaptation and resilience. And the Coalition for Climate Resilient Investment, CDRI, that we are a founder member of along with India, I think that is a really important pathway for many of us. But underpinning all of that is this question of finance. And this is an extremely timely session. I don't know if people have read Larry Fink's letter this morning, a letter from the chief of the world's largest investment firm to his investors, essentially saying we can no longer treat climate change as if it is a short-term blip. This is a fundamental shift in the way that we must think about investment and climate risk. And, it makes sense if you're taking out a 25-year mortgage. What happens if that property is flooded? What happens if you can't get fire or flood insurance? What happens if you're a pension regulator trying to ensure that your investments are safe for the long term? And we started thinking very hard about this topic only 2 years ago in the UK, so it's great to be sharing knowledge. Our Bank of England Governor, Mark Carney, led a global task force on how you actually disclose financial risk, how you provide that information to investors and to shareholders. And Mark will be working with me in delivering the COP, amplifying that work, and also looking to how you take it through to investments, not just as a risk appetite, but what are the increased returns you can get from climate affiliated investing. And I think what we're starting to see is a real volume increase in the appetite of funding from public and private institutions looking for these sustainable, lower carbon, climate-proofed investment destinations, if you like, but also a sort of increased appetite for new tech opportunities. Again, I think it was said last night by Prime Minister Bill that it tends to be the early adopters and the consistent adopters of technology that end up sharing the prizes, if you like, of those changes. And so what are the innovations that are out there that we can collectively invest in and drive down costs, but also drive up the economic opportunity from creating them as sustainable long-term investments? So we will continue to work rapidly on this. We are very keen to share knowledge and learn from the rest of the world. I think we are all in this together as we move as a global system towards a more climate resilient financial series of investments. But there are immense opportunities to work both through public finance, but also through public-private partnerships to drive down the cost of capital and drive up investment. And if I may share one final thing, I was the energy minister and climate change minister in the UK government until recently. And we have had an immense success with our offshore wind. We have a very windy and shallow North Sea basin. It's a wonderful opportunity. And we were buying offshore wind at about £157 per megawatt hour 2.5 years ago. That price dropped quite dramatically when we first started to focus on this. It was coming in at sort of 60 odd pounds per megawatt hour. And then we did a piece of public and private policy making where we essentially termed out the government's requirement or minimum requirements to buy offshore wind. So we gave that sector a revenue certainty. We're not subsidizing it, we gave them certainty of purchase. And it dropped the cost of capital 50% overnight in that sector. And in our last auction, we were receiving bids to provide offshore wind at about £39.65, which was cheaper than the wholesale price. And that has happened in 2 years. So that is a technology whose cost has dropped like a tech stock. And these are 200-meter windmills. These aren't, bits and bytes. But because we had worked as a government with the private sector to change the financial risk associated with it. So that combination of good public policy making and bringing in the right investors can deliver real dividends in terms of cost of capital reduction.
Thank you very much, Ms. O'Neill. And you alluded to technology, and you alluded earlier to some of the leaders in this area, UK, of course, being one of the leaders in climate change. But folks, they always say that the future comes first to California. And when we talk about the future and we talk about technology, we are very pleased that we have Lieutenant Governor Kounalakis here, who can tell us how California makes sure that the future always comes there first.
Well, thank you. One of the things that we like to say is that California is the world's coming attraction. So I hope that since we're in India and Bollywood, you get the reference. But California is very forward-leaning on this issue. And when you showed some of the conditions that need to be present to make real change in India, and you highlight California, a couple of them jumped out at me. And one of them is popular support for the movement. And in California, the general population is extremely supportive of moving away from fossil fuels and very supportive of our 2045 goals of becoming carbon neutral. This did not happen overnight. This is not one political party versus another. In fact, the very first standards that were set were signed into law by Arnold Schwarzenegger, who's, of course, a member of the Republican Party, and has now been carried forward by 3 consecutive governors. So we have tremendous public support toward achieving our 2045 goals of becoming carbon neutral. And for California as now the 5th largest economy in the world, if we were a country, this presents enormous opportunity. And I think that when you talk about the value proposition, you also have to look at the downside of not investing. And many of you have seen in the news the wildfires that have been raging in California. And again, general recognition among the public that the weather has changed. We now have winds across our state in the fall when it's dry, and fires break out, and it's very difficult to be able to be everywhere all the time to put them out before they become catastrophic. So as we look forward to meet our 2045 goals, there are a couple of areas that are really ripe for investment. And since there are many folks in this room who are either in the banking industry and looking for different investments, and maybe those of you here who are in technology and looking at innovative ways to move toward carbon neutrality and renewables, the areas where I think are really primed for the highest value if we can make advancements really have to do with battery technology, which can amplify the already in place wind and solar that exist in our state and elsewhere. We also have made great advancements in energy efficiency, but there's still more room to grow in that field. Zero emission vehicles are something that we've already made a pledge and signed into law our 2030 goal, which is to have 5 million zero emission vehicles on the road. Tesla is churning them out, but we're going to need a lot more cars to be able to get there. And then in terms of, as was recognized, that there is a lot of investment already coming from public and private. In terms of public investment, California has already contributed about $25 billion in rebates and tax credits to get us as far as we are. And we have a robust cap and trade program, which frankly, we welcome countries to come and learn more and see how we've managed to set it up and how it's functioning, which is driving more investment into reaching these as well. And then finally, just a word about carbon sequestration. We have the University of California system, our 10 universities, including research universities and 2 national laboratories. There is a lot of work going on for wildly different approaches to deal with the question of carbon sequestration and advances. So I wanted to just really specify these areas where I think there's simply no question about it that when the 5th largest economy in the world is saying, find these advances in technology, we need them to fulfill our goals, that there's tremendous financial opportunity for those who are able to come up with these solutions.
Thank you very much, Lieutenant Governor. And I think both Ms. O'Neill and the Lieutenant Governor have set it up very well for you, Mr. Sharp, because they've alluded to how policy has made a real difference in terms of the economics of these underlying green technologies, these green business models. How do you see that playing out in the financial sector? Do you think that the trillions of dollars that are required around the world for the green transformation will be made available?
Well, it's an interesting question, of course. But first, I would like to refer to what the Prime Minister said earlier on, the paradigm shift in our economic model. And I think that's exactly what it is about. The models of today, that means more input, more output, more pollution, are not sustainable models. In other words, we need to find a balance between output, how we use resources, and all of that in a sustainable behavior. Now, this is not easy, but I also believe, in fact, there's no other choice. And it creates a huge dilemma, of course, for policymakers and politicians overall, because how do you basically make sustainability, with all its impact, understandable to the general public? Especially, in fact, if there's a risk that it costs jobs, notably, in fact, in the most polluting industries. And maybe the simple answer is you need to create new jobs. And I would like to refer, in fact, to a sentence that was pronounced by former US Vice President Al Gore, who said already a number of years ago, sustainability is the single biggest business opportunity since the Industrial Revolution. So in other words, in fact, sustainability is not an additional constraint, an additional cost factor. It's a huge opportunity. But then the question about, because sustainability is about efficiency, about new technologies, basically it's about innovation. But how to fund this? And then and we heard a lot about this last night already. The public sector, of course, with all fiscal constraints, will not manage to do this all by itself. In other words, you need to mobilize private capital in the private sector. And that's where, as a financier, that's where capital markets come into the picture. And I must say, in fact, when you're looking today at the huge appetite that investors have and the readiness to invest and support initiatives, technologies, projects that go in that direction is enormous. And if I may say 2 words about why am I sitting here, coming from tiny Luxembourg, what can we contribute? Well, in fact, we created in 2016 what we call the Luxembourg Green Exchange. It's still the world's unique exchange platform for green and sustainable financial products. And in fact, this has moved in a couple of years to the world leader. We have a 50% world market share of all green instruments that are being issued worldwide and listed on an exchange. And why does that happen? In fact, because we deliver a platform for issuers. That means those who need the capital and investors who are ready to invest with a purpose. In other words, they want to know what's happening with their money, where the money is going. And we are today, in fact, having already $250 billion on that platform, and it's moving forward every day. So private capital and private capital markets need to get involved in order to make things happen and more speedily than what we do today.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Prime Minister, I think Mr. Schaaf has pointed out that there are $250 billion already on his exchange. There's plenty of capital available. Can you help us understand, for example, in India, how do we get some of that capital coming into sectors in India where we can affect such a green transformation? What would be your advice to a country like India or the developing world in general?
In fact,
that was to Mr. Prime Minister. Yeah.
Finance is very important. Finance is one of the 4 pillars of climate change: mitigation, adaptation, finance, and technology. And during the last 2 years, 2017, 2018, about $380 billion were mobilized to deal with the climate change, of which about 44% were public finance. But money alone cannot deal with the problem. And where does the money come from? It's allocated by the Ministry of Finance. But when you attend the COP, most of the ministers are ministers of environment. And Ministry of Environment is not that powerful in any government. So when I was Special Envoy for Climate Change of the Secretary General of the United Nations, 2007, 2008, before I was called back to Korea, I suggested that we should have finance ministers meeting at the time of COP. And in actual fact, the year was 2007, most important year in the history of COP 13 in Bali. At the time, we had finance ministers meeting together with COP. Since then, no ministers of finance met there. But I think I suggested, Ms. O'Neill, that maybe you suggest that we should have a kind of finance minister meeting in conjunction with or before or the official meeting or COP, because they are the one who has the purse of power, money there.
Ms. O'Neill, is that going to happen?
Yes, well, again, to reassure you that that did happen this year. So there was actually the COP presidency. My good friends from Chile worked to convene ministers from finance agencies, also from transport and energy, which was the first time it's ever been done. Now, we didn't have a full house, but I think there are other opportunities. As I understand it, the global financial ministers have this clearly on their agenda. And one of the great opportunities, actually, almost serendipitously, is the UK not only as COP president will be G7 president next year. Italy are our COP partner, and who'll be hosting the pre-COP and the youth COP, our G20 presidency. And of course, the G20 will then come to India the year after. So there are fantastic opportunities to put these very fundamental economic and financial questions clearly on the world's agenda going forward. But I just wanted to follow up on what Mr. Schaaf said, that the way to get these financial flows is to focus on the opportunity. I mean, it is astonishing that there will be trillions of dollars spent on new infrastructure, particularly more infrastructure will be built in the next 20 years than has happened in the past 200, and the opportunity to build that in a climate resilient way, ideally using lower carbon building materials, is absolutely enormous, and I know there will be financial support for that. The opportunity to reshape cities, to be investing in new forms of mobility and charging infrastructure, the opportunity to create entirely new industries supporting this. Again, almost, it's not by accident, because the UK I'm very proud to say, was the first country in the world to pass a Climate Change Act and to set up those institutions like our Committee on Climate Change, who can give us independent advice. But we have 400,000 low carbon jobs in the UK now. To put that in context, that's bigger than the aerospace sector. So you will know us for building Rolls-Royce engines and having a very rich supply chain. We now have more jobs in the low carbon economy, and crucially, those jobs are happening in parts of the country that have been very hard to regenerate through normal means. So I don't know if anyone here has ever been to Grimsby or Hull, famous former fishing ports. Hooray! If you went now, you would see that some of the world's biggest renewable technology companies have located their control centers there, and the car parks are full of Teslas and other amazing vehicles. And this is an utterly regenerative process happening right along some of our most depressed coastal regions. And it is the same right across the world. So there is an immense economic opportunity from doing this. There is finance that wants to invest in this. There is, of course, a requirement. I think there is a real need almost for a taxonomy, because we don't have a good taxonomy for green investments, and I commend the efforts of the exchange. We also in the UK have been helping the world list various green bonds on our own London Stock Exchange, but we don't have a joined up version of what green or sustainable investment looks like, and I think that is something that we very rapidly do need to provide. And
So,
we're looking...
Mr. Sharp, let me just build on what Ms. O'Neill said, which is a taxonomy. When you run a green stock exchange or you talk about green bonds, are those classifications now quite solid and robust so that we can say this is green and this is not green? Can we come up with those kinds of classifications?
Well, you know, when I'm looking at what happens in various parts of the world, and it applies to the European Union initiatives, and which recently has come to a conclusion on taxonomy. So in fact, basically, we should know now what is green and what is not. But the point is, to me, from Europe to China, through the US, to look at the biggest markets, already before, 85%, 90% of what was green was clear. And very often we focus on the remaining 10% to take it as an excuse not to act. Whereas in fact, we can take action on all the rest. And I think, in fact, that's what is important. And taxonomy, in fact, now that we have a definition in Europe, well, it will evolve. And what we say today, in fact, will not be true, in fact, tomorrow or the day after tomorrow. So in other words, it's an evolution. And above all, what we need to do is act upon what is already today extremely clear and acceptable, in fact, to a vast majority to market participants. And that is what really makes the difference. The time is ticking, as we know. Therefore, there is no time to lose on another couple of years on getting a harmonization of the taxonomy between China, Europe, and the US. Would make no sense. We are just losing the momentum of...
So, Lieutenant Governor, tell us a little bit about the monitoring, reporting, and verification part of this, because clearly California has been absolutely at the forefront of bringing down carbon emissions and getting on a low carbon pathway, as O'Neill was telling us. But how have you attacked this whole issue of monitoring, reporting, and verification? How has that gotten embedded in the way people are looking at green transformation?
Well, really, that hasn't been a problem. Our electric grid right now, for instance, is about a third fired by renewables, wind and solar primarily, about a third gas, and a third sort of a combination of some legacy nuclear, hydropower, and some other things. And so we're able to keep pretty close track on where the energy powering the grid is coming from. But I think that maybe one of the other things that's sort of the, I think it's important to state the obvious here, which is that the United States right now, and the leadership of the United States, is going a very different direction from where California is going. And so I guess I'd just like to also say, for those who are equally determined to move toward a new energy future, that at the subnational level, California actually has quite a bit of autonomy to move toward these goals. Again, right now, we're actually fighting with the federal government over whether or not we can set our own emission standards, which we've been doing since the 1970s, and they're trying to take the power away from us. So we have some serious challenges going on. But again, what I think that we can go back to with this economy, which has been growing even as our emissions have been decreasing, doing what Al Gore would always say, which is that you can grow the economy and protect the environment. We're doing it. Is that it's almost down to an individual level when you talk to students, when you talk to researchers, when you talk to investors and innovators, that this is almost a personal ambition of people in this space to be able to, as we say in California, disrupt or hack the status quo. And that status quo is an energy profile of fossil fuels, which again is predominant. We know that. And we also know that those in the fossil fuel industry are not actually so keen on giving up their market share. You know, if we stick to the point of this panel here, which is to talk about the financial motivation, in disrupting the fossil fuel industry, I think that you can imagine the upside potential for what this will mean for renewable energy. If we can replace that market share with something that so many who have been engaged on this issue, and again, it's not uniform, it's not everywhere, it's not even everywhere in our own country, that potential is there. And I guess I'd just like to underscore that because California is all the way on the other side of the world from where we are right now, and we like to think of ourselves as the new transatlanticist, even though we're way out there on the Pacific, but very much looking forward to the upcoming COP and participating in it. We can at the subnational level, just as we have pursued the expansion of the Under 2 coalition, and that this is not something that I think should be looked at and marginalized in any way, because particularly when you look at attitudes among young people, there is no skepticism among young people in California, I can tell you, coupled with the fact that we have had 7 of the 10 most devastating wildfires in the history of our state in the last decade. So there is motivation, there is capital, and there is government intention around this.
So we literally have the wildfire in our backyard in California, right? So we have to deal with that. Hack the status quo. I like that. Anybody from the audience who might want to ask a question from the distinguished panelists? Yes, please.
John Cumbers, I write for Forbes and cover manufacturing and biomanufacturing. I visited Jamnagar on Friday, Reliance Industries. They have the world's largest oil refinery, a big producer of CO2. One thing that they have that a lot of people don't know about is an algae to oil program. And that's a fantastic program. It uses synthetic biology to convert CO2 that they bubble through into crude oil that's made from algae. One big difference is it uses renewable carbon. So it's sucking CO2 out of the air and it's putting it back into the air when you burn that fuel. That's a big difference from the other carbon that they use, which is oil that they're sucking up from the ground, burning it and putting it into the air. There is an elegant solution. Unfortunately, it's not economically viable right now. It costs more than crude oil. Now, there is an economic solution. It's cap and trade. It's the carbon tax. California has it. The UK has it. India doesn't have it. My question is, what advice would the panelists from countries that do have cap and trade or carbon tax give to countries like India or Australia or France that don't have such economic incentives?
Would you like to?
Thank you, and thank you for showing us, allowing us to understand more about some of the incredible innovation that's taking place domestically. It's a great technology. If you can add carbon capture and storage, you then make it carbon negative too, which is very exciting. So the UK, I believe, was the petri dish for the original carbon trading schemes, and it was done originally on an opt-in basis. So it was done essentially by industry participants coming together by understanding that you could have carbon trading in the UK. And from tiny beginnings, it then grew into a national scheme and then obviously to an EU scheme, the EU ETS, which historically had struggled to send strong price signals, but really proud of the reforms that have happened that have started to push up the price of carbon. So my advice would be to always form coalitions of the willing. It is always easier to lead from the front when you have tested things, rather than to make very significant political changes as a starter Once you have the schemes up and running, of course, you can join, as we talked about, and there is nothing electronically to stop countries joining any one of these schemes. But equally, you can then work to see what are the things that government could do. And I don't know if people know, but the UK is described as an island of coal surrounded by fish. And as long as recent times, only 10 years ago when I first went into politics, 40% of our power generation was from coal. We are now down to about 2% on a bad day, and it will be 0 by 2025. And that has been achieved through policy, unilateral policy pricing on top of the ETS schemes, and also, if I may say, a focus on air quality. So those schemes are incredibly powerful. They often need tweaking, but you can start between particular industries and then you can grow into a national scheme. Or, of course, you can work and leapfrog straight to a national scheme. And we now have multiple examples around the world, including in China, of domestic schemes that have been imposed. But they're a really good way of delivering CO2 reduction.
Lieutenant Governor, you want to add something to that?
Anyone who is interested in coming to California and seeing up close the way we run our cap and trade program, we have the ability to bring people in and show them the way that we've structured our system. It brings much needed resources into the programs that we do to invest in moving toward renewables. So John, thank you for that question.
So we'll take a couple more questions. Yes,
Okay,
please.
my name is Dr. Sharma. I just have some comments on Paris Accord. It was a historical accord, but would remain in history as far as restricting temperature to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Post-Paris, we had the highest growth on energy consumption and resultant CO2 emissions. Now, there's no action on that. The three nations walked out of Paris, the second largest emitter, US, along with Syria and one more nation. Now, providing clean air remains to be the biggest problem in developing nations. I don't know what's the agenda of COP26. Would providing clean air, especially for developing nations, would be the major
So your
agenda?
question is to Ms. O'Neill about COP26. Is that your question?
Yeah,
is your
that's
question
right.
to Ms. O'Neill about COP26?
Right.
All right.
Well, I think the beauty of the Paris Agreement, the reason that the world was able to agree, was the permission given to individual countries to set their own decarbonisation pathways. And I think that sense of national determination is incredibly important. And the NDCs, as you say, sir, are the right vehicle for countries to express their own priorities, which can be very different, and respect a development pathway, which is vital. But you raised the question of clean air. And I think one of the things we are increasingly understanding is these co-benefits. That decarbonisation is economically accretive in terms of growth, can be, if you are getting the right pricing in the system. You get the co-benefit of clean air. I will quote the governor of Alberta, who, when they phased out coal generation in Alberta, said they went from 43 smog days a year to 0. You also get the health benefits of clean air, and of course you get the sustainability and livelihood benefits of having more resilient natural ecosystems. But for me, these are obvious benefits, but it is for individual countries to frame those in their own contributions with the maximum amount of encouragement and support. And if I may, I don't mean leadership in the sense of telling other countries what to do. I mean leadership in the sense of facing up to historical responsibilities, which is why, as the minister, I was very pleased when the UK was the first industrialized country in the world to pass legislation that will put our net zero by 2050 targets on our statute book, and we did that this summer.
So
last
the
summer.
UK started the Industrial Revolution, and it's also going to end it.
Well, we're going to move to the third phase of the Industrial Revolution, which is the ability to develop and grow sustainably.
Excellent. So final question from the audience. Yes, please.
Thank you. The question is to Lieutenant Governor Leni Kunelakas. First of all, we are so grateful for the first woman Lieutenant Governor of California to be here. The question is, since future comes first to California, as Mr. Sinha was saying, how can California work with India to include the next generation to be better prepared for problem solving in this area? Thank you.
Thank you so much for the question. So in my trip so far, I had the opportunity to meet with the Minister of Environment and offer best practices exchanges. We've done that kind of work in the past with India. I think there's more to do. I think one of the areas, just to the previous question about air quality, part of the reason that California is so advanced is because our problems have been so significant. We're a part of the United States that really developed in the post-automobile era, and public transportation in the Los Angeles area is almost, it's very far behind, we'll just say that. And so we've been grappling with this for a long time. But I actually would like to kind of deflect that, because I think one of the questions that was asked is, when I look at India, I see this tremendous talent and tremendous innovative spirit and drive toward innovation that that entrepreneurs in India know that you can hit the jackpot if you can crack certain nuts, certain tough problems. So I'm actually really interested in hearing a little more about how you get capital from Europe and other sources that are looking for places to place it into a place like India, where you have all this talent and innovation and drive, but where access to capital might not be as easy.
Thank you very much, Lieutenant Governor, and that was unfortunately the last comment we could take in this session, a fascinating session. I want to thank all the distinguished panelists for their perspectives, their views. Thank you to the audience for excellent questions and listening to us. So with that, I'll conclude the session. But before I do that, I will say, being the person who's been working on this report for a while now with some excellent colleagues from ORF, that many of the issues that we have discussed on this panel are also discussed in this report. We've tried to provide a roadmap as to how we can learn from California, from the UK, and from Germany as three leading examples of a green transformation, and apply those lessons to India as well. So if you get a chance, I would request you all to go through the report. We think it's been written in a pretty succinct way, so you'll get all the kind of key insights fairly quickly. But hopefully this will start to set the stage for a series of discussions and collaborations over the next few years, so that as the UK and California and other countries go through their green transformation, we in India will continue to proceed on ours and become a global leader in this regard as well. So thank you once again to our distinguished panelists, and I'll conclude the session with that. Thank you.